Good morning. My name is Jean-Francois Bilodeau, or JF, whatever works best for you. Welcome to the JavaScript Frameworks for Manager, also known as SPA for Managers, single page application for managers. A couple of quick things before we get started. Well, first of all, allow me to bid you the official good morning. Welcome to the seminar. Glad you could join us on a Friday. And again, apologies for the confusion on Wednesday, but again, very glad that you guys could join us today. A couple of quick things before we jump into the seminar for today. Actually, I'll just advance over here. To maximize our time together, we've got 3 good hours, and I'm hoping to hopefully keep it under 3 hours, but this is something we could stretch across even multiple days if you wanted to, though it's not my intention. Hey, I recognize the weekend is coming up very quickly. If you do have any questions at any time, please don't be shy to bring it up to us. You've got the chat window, you've got the question window that's available for you. And to test that, the first thing actually I do want to make sure of is that you guys can hear me okay. If so, if you could let me know via the chat window, drop me a little note just to confirm that sound is working at our end. That would be greatly appreciated. Or you could raise your hand if you wanted to through the attendees window, but I do want to make sure sound is working. Sound is good. All right. Perfect. Well, thank you very much for confirming. So when it comes to questions, again, I do welcome questions at any time. I'll do my best to answer any questions that you'll have. There is a fair amount of curriculum I'm hoping to get through over here, and I am going to straddle multiple levels, starting with hopefully the broad picture, keeping it as non-technical as possible, but I am going to get into some technical stuff. I am going to get into some code, some demos, so I don't want to just superficially look at it. But we've only got three hours together. Some demos will have to be superficial. But again, if you have any questions, if we can complement the curriculum in any way, please let me know. The slides will also be available after the presentation. Furthermore, this presentation is being recorded. So if you guys have any if you guys want to review whatever we'll have covered in this presentation after the fact, you will be able to do so. I believe an email will be sent to you from WebAge, giving you access to the slides, as well as the recording of the presentation. So this will be available for you. Excellent. All right. So let's talk about what I'm hoping to cover with you guys for the next 3 hours or so. We're going to start with a brief discussion of web application. All right, where we started and where we're at today, keeping it again very superficial, getting into the idea of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Most of you are probably familiar with how those 3 technologies are central to building web application today. Then we're going to talk about SPA, single page application, and how the web has moved towards or moved away from being just a page-centric technology to being really a development platform, a platform on which we want to run our code. And following that, let's talk frameworks and libraries. And there's 5 in particular, probably the 5 biggest one out there, but I had to limit myself to 5. There are more we could have covered. So we're going to talk about jQuery, which is by far the world's most widely used JavaScript library. We'll talk about what it is, why it's so widely used, and a demo of the code as well, jQuery code. We'll then move into Bootstrap, which is technically not a JavaScript library, but often gets lumped with JavaScript library. So I do want to make sure we have an idea as to what Bootstrap is, and by the same token, what Bootstrap is not. And that will bring us to the 3 big frameworks that we see out there in the industry when it comes to developing SPA, single page application, starting with Angular, moving to React, and moving to Vue. Actually, I'm seeing over here it says AngularJS. It should just say Angular. So that's a mistake that'll have to be corrected. I'll talk about why as we carry along. So that should keep us nicely busy. And at the end, I'd like to have a quick conversation with you guys to help us determine which one of those technologies, or maybe even combination of those technology, would be preferable for us. And that's an open question. I will not favor one of those technology over another. I do have my own opinion. I'll share with you some of my opinion as we carry along, but they're all great in their own way. So there's not one that is better than the other. There's a reason why they're all used out there in the industry. So let's jump right in. Let's get started with some of the foundation that I'm assuming you guys are somewhat familiar with. Let's start with an overview of web application. And another assumption I'm making at this point is that you guys can see the presentation over here. If not, please let me know, but I'll make that assumption for now. So when it comes to developing web application, when the web was first born unofficially in 1989, so it's been around for 31 years, which was very much a page-centric technology, a static page technology, where we could consume a page, no JavaScript, no CSS, just HTML over here, consume a page, read the content. And of course, the wonder at this point was the idea of hyperlinking. I see blue text that's underlined, boom, I click on it, brings me to another page. That was wonderful technology back in those days, not necessarily new, but it did open up a new world of possibilities when it comes to providing content online. Now, of course, that did not last very long. The idea of static web pages, eventually forms were added to HTML fairly quickly, where we could provide some level of interactivity. And you've all seen forms before. Type in information, for example, to register yourself with a website. What's your username, your email, your password, first name, last name, click submit. We send that information to the server, new page comes up, congratulations, you're now registered. So that was a natural evolution to the web, a combination over here of extending the HTML and HTTP to provide a slightly more interactive experience, but still a very much page-centric experience, in the sense that as I'm filling out the page, yes, there's some level of interactivity. When I click the submit button, I get a new page. Send information to the server, get a new page back. And every time we perform an action, every time we want to update the state of the application, a new page needs to be provided. That started to change around 1995 when JavaScript was introduced in the mix. And JavaScript's a bit of a language that has a bit of interesting history behind it. And it's a bit of a victim of its own success, where originally JavaScript was designed to be a functional programming language, but eventually, fairly early on, we've added additional paradigm like object orientation to JavaScript. And also, we actually renamed the language. It wasn't even called JavaScript originally, but the whole reason why it's called JavaScript today is not because in any way it's related to the Java programming language. Java and JavaScript both evolved independently, but it was named this way strictly for marketing reason. When Java was introduced to the world, and Sun Microsystem went to their first demo of Java, one of the things that they've demonstrated was the idea of hot Java, running Java in a browser. Some of you may remember the days of Java Servlet, Java Applet, pardon me. If not, don't worry about it. I'm going back a ways over here. But when Java applets were demonstrated, today they would seem primitive, right? Little toys. But back then, when they first presented Java applet, they got a standing ovation, and everybody went gaga over the idea of Java applets for good reason. It was the first time anybody had demonstrated really interactive content on a web page, beyond just forms on a web page. around that time, Netscape was developing its own scripting language that was meant to integrate with HTML with the browser. And when they saw that presentation, they obviously saw the marketing potential behind Java and the potential period behind Java. So they actually licensed the name perpetually from Sun Microsystem, renamed their language from, I think it was LiveScript or OnScript, I forget the original name, to JavaScript. So really, if you compare Java and JavaScript, you can say that the only 4 similarities between the two programming languages is the letter J, A, V, and A. Beyond that, 2 very different programming languages. So this said, the web did not stop its evolution there. JavaScript started changing the way we could develop our application, provide much more interactive content to our users. And out of that was born something that we call DHTML. What the heck is DHTML? Let me crack open my whiteboard. I did not include that in the slide. As quickly as my whiteboard will deign to come up. But while this is not happening, DHTML is the intersection of 3 technology. DHTML by itself is not a technology. It's actually a combination of HTML, CSS, which was emerging back then, and JavaScript. And this is what we use today to create dynamic web application. I mean, that's what the D in DHTML stands for, dynamic HTML. And just to highlight that, and I will assume that you guys have some basic knowledge of web development. I don't expect you to be gurus, but most of us probably understand that HTML is what we use for our structure. Here, we also have JavaScript, which is an actual programming language, an empirical programming language that we use over here to provide interactivity with our web application. And one more component of that triad is, of course, CSS, cascading style sheet. Those elements combined together is what we call the HTML. All right, so it's really a combination, a technique, if you prefer, that makes use of those 3 technologies. So cool, we can create dynamic web pages now. We can start moving towards the idea of single page application, but there's still one essential component missing over here. Yes, we can interact with the user, but we also need to interact with the server. All right, we've got our server in the backend over here running whatever, it's not important. We communicate to the server via HTTP, but the web is still limited to a page model, meaning that if I need to submit something to the server, we need to load a new page. Send a request to the server, get a new page. This problem was addressed kind of sort of stealthily when Microsoft released OWA, Outlook Web Access. They wanted to address that challenge over here. They wanted people to be able to look at their email through the web, but have a mechanism by which we could poll the mail server to see if there's new emails available without having to reload the page. Microsoft had a hidden extension to Internet Explorer called the XML HTTP request class, a new set of API. And it was meant to be used strictly for Outlook Web Access so that, again, OWA could query the server using JavaScript, could query the server, get information from the server, and update the page via the HTML without having to do a full page refresh. Well, of course, when web developers saw that OWA could refresh the page, could fetch information from the server without doing a page refresh, what do you think happened? Of course, they looked at the code, figured out how IE was doing it. They came across the XML HTTP request object, and the rest is history. In the sense that at this point, developers recognize that there is a way now to request data from the server, send data to the server, get data back to the server. Other browsers followed suit. It was not a standard API, it was a Microsoft extension to IE, but other browsers followed suit. It became a de facto standard and eventually an actual standard with JavaScript, with the browser object model. So now that we have the XML HTTP request object, now there's the final piece of the puzzle that we needed over here, where now our applications can send HTTP requests to the server, get responses back, and that adds to the equation an acronym that all of us are probably familiar with, the idea of AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Actually, the name is a bit dated. It's no longer AJAX. It should be called AJAO today, or even AJAO. What do I mean by that? Well, asynchronous, still the case. We continue and we favor asynchronicity when it comes to the browser. And actually, JavaScript was carefully designed to be as asynchronous as possible, and its asynchronous capabilities just keep growing. JavaScript, of course, that's a given. There's only one programming language for the browser. Actually, technically two. We'll talk a little bit about that as we carry along. But for now, we'll say one programming language that is supported by the browser. And XML, that's a part that no longer really applies. We used to use XML, which was created in 2001, at least finalized in 2001, to exchange payload between browsers and servers. But as nice as XML is, it's a bit on the heavy side. And though browsers have support for XML, I mean, fundamentally they use XML technology and variants for HTML. And by the way, just in case we're not aware, XML and HTML are two loosely related technology. Right? One does not build on top of the other. Right? They are both inspired by SGML. HTML is inspired by SGML. XML is technically what we call an application of SGML. So because they both kind of sort of come from the same source, but one is inspired, the other one is what we call an application, they're not the same. But anyway, what I'm getting at over here is XML is rarely used. Today, we're generally not going to use XML. We are going to use AJAX, which stands for JSON. All right, JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. We're going to see a little bit of JSON. It's not the purpose of this seminar, but we're going to see a little bit of that. But really today, I wouldn't even call it AJAO. I would call it AJAO in the sense of W, in the sense that it's asynchronous JavaScript and whatever. It doesn't really matter. You can send whatever you want to your server. You can receive whatever you want from your server. Whoops. Not bad. Yeah, go. All right, and generally for APIs, we're going to favor JSON today. And there's a number of good reasons for that. But again, I want to emphasize, especially for the architect in the classroom or the managers who are trying to decide what technologies, what payload should we exchange back and forth, you don't need to limit yourself to JSON. It's a good choice, but you can use, for example, binary payload. You could upload, and this is commonly done out there in the industry, use JavaScript to capture, say, an image. It could be from the camera on the browser. It could be from the file system. It does really matter, and send that to your server via an HTTP request, an AJAX HTTP request. As part of the response, it could be, of course, a JSON payload, could be an XML document, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be another picture, a binary file. It could be a PDF document, it could be an Excel spreadsheet. The sky's the limit. It doesn't really matter what we send back and forth. It's just a question of course, orchestrating what we can do. Now, there's one more significant evolution that I want to highlight, the most important out of all the evolutions we've encountered out there in the web. All of those are important, but nothing has been a game changer as the evolution to HTML5, which is the current version of HTML. Actually, a bit of a historical note, there was never supposed to be an HTML5 standard. We were supposed to stop as HTML4. 4.01 was the last version. We were going to move to XHTML. And some of you have probably encountered that in the early 2000 to about mid 2000, it was the de facto standard, XHTML, XHTML 1.0, XHTML 1.1. There was even in works an XHTML 2.0, which was going to be a major shift out there. And I've worked with pretty much every version of HTML, JavaScript, CSS out there. But I have to admit, I've never been as excited about web development as I am today with HTML5. The capabilities that we have with HTML5 blows everything else that we've had out of the water in just about every facet. And if I can highlight two important facets for us, the first one is going to be user experience. What we can do today with a web browser, it cannot be compared to what we could do to any version of HTML prior to that. So HTML went from being a page technology to today what we would call I'm going to call it a application platform technology. Just like for those of you who develop code, let's say in .NET, for the desktop, that would be an application platform. You could say Windows is an application platform, Macintosh, Linux, that sort of thing. Swing in Java, Jot, and there's different application platform. Let's look at the web as being an application platform, and the browser being the environment that executes our code. So it's a big shift in mentality that we are encountering over here. So the capabilities of HTML, HTML5 are phenomenal, and they just carry on getting better. Another big change over here to get accustomed to, and I'm hoping I'm preaching to the choir over here, but just in case we're not aware, with HTML5, a big change that we're encountering over here is that it's now a living standard. As opposed to the way we were developing HTML standards, where we had HTML, well, technically 1.0, really never came to be, then HTML2, HTML3, HTML4, XHTML 1.0, XHTML 1.1, etc. Now, instead of going through big, massive standards, which come out years apart, and by the time they come out, the industry has moved on, HTML5 is a living standard. Don't go looking for HTML6. It might never happen. In the sense that's similar to Windows 10 and a lot of technologies out there, now we're just going to continuously add to the standard, new capabilities. So the idea over here is the HTML5 standard that we have today. If we take a look at it 1 year from now, we'll have even more capabilities. Two other kind of characters. I said there would be two, but let's make it three. One of which is application platform. That is comparable to what we can do with desktop application. Another characteristics when it comes to HTML5 is actually accessibility. Out of all the HTML standard out there, it is by far the most accessible. For people who need assistive technology, who have limitation in terms of their technological capability, the tools that they use to consume the web. One of the cool part with HTML5 is there hasn't been any standards out there that valued accessibility to the level that HTML5 does. So when people ask me, is it worthwhile to go to HTML5? Should I bother upgrading to HTML5? Well, the prime reason would be accessibility. Let's take advantage of the accessibility that HTML5 has to offer, which is something that we did not have previously. And one last thing when it comes to HTML5, which I think is very important over here, is browser support. If you've developed web application in the 1990s, early 2000s, you probably remember and get cold sweats down your back thinking about the browser war. Netscape versus IE, IE versus Mozilla versus Chrome, where we often had to develop 2 or more versions of the same web application. I'm sure that this sounds familiar to some of you, and if that's the case, my sympathies. I've been there. I hated that part of the job. One of the coolest part about HTML5 is now browsers are on board. And if you were to ask, who develops the HTML5 standard? Who sits on the design committee? That sort of thing. Well, you'll recognize a number of names over here, things like Google. Google. Why is that a big deal? Well, Google is almost the web. They have both the most popular website on the planet, as well as the most popular browser on the planet. For better or for worse, I'll let you decide, but we cannot negate their significance. Who else do we have on that? We have Apple. Why Apple? Well, things like iOS, iPhones, and of course they're on the Macs, that sort of thing. We could include Facebook, Twitter, and other players out there. We've got Mozilla. Who the heck is Mozilla? Firefox, as well as other projects, significant projects that are a huge contributor to the technology that we're using. So the folks that make Mozilla are also on board. And there's one latecomer to HTML5, but a significant latecomer, Microsoft. Why am I dropping those names? Well, the reason is, if you take a look at those names over here, what do we have? Well, we have Google, which makes the world's most widely used web browser. We've got Mozilla, which makes one of the world's most widely used web browser. We've got Microsoft, IE, Edge, again, very influential web browser out there. Apple, Safari. They also make the significant web browser. And actually, I omitted one I feel kind of guilty, Opera, which is the only company today that has a commercial web browser, but very well regarded web browser. So if you take a look at this, you've got all the major browser vendors on board with HTML5. And they're actually competing on performance and compatibility with HTML5. And I think that's hugely significant over here. Microsoft has abandoned their strategies of trying to create a rift in the web, have 2 versions of websites, one for IE, one for the rest of the web. No, IE 9, 10, 11, they're standard compliant. Edge is standard compliant. And actually Edge, as you probably know, is fundamentally Chrome repackaged and tweaked by Microsoft, but it's fundamentally the Chromium code base that they use. So again, I think that's hugely important to recognize that when it comes to HTML5, it is a significant game changer that we have out there. Let's go back to the slides a little bit over here. I just want to highlight those elements. Oops, over here, where are we? There we almost go. There we are. So HTML5 game changer, I cannot emphasize that enough. Again, in my entire career, working since the days of HTML 1.0, nothing compares to what we have today. Approaches richness and capability of a desktop operating system. Another cool feature over here is the idea of write once, run anywhere. I can create now a UI and run it just about anywhere, in the sense that, and this is another cool feature of HTML5, CSS version 3, and of course, the latest version of JavaScript, where if I'm careful in the way I design my application, I can have the same code base to run the application on a mobile device, scaling it up to a tablet, scaling it up to a full-size screen, 4K display, it doesn't matter. I don't have to write 2 or 3 versions of the application. And we'll talk about some techniques that we can use to achieve that. Now, the application has to be built for it, but you should not have to write 2 versions. All right, we can talk about responsive web application. Actually, we'll hint at that as we carry along. So let's hold on to that. But that's an important point over here where now I don't have to worry about, are my users running Windows or Chrome OS or Linux or Mac or iOS or Android or whatever else. As long as they have an HTML5 web browser, we're golden. Let's take advantage of that. Now, we've already established that. We know that HTML, JavaScript, and CSS are the foundation. We use HTML to structure the information we're going to present to our user. Not visually, but semantically. What does the information mean? That's important from an accessible perspective. Even with HTML5, and I'm going to say especially with HTML5, it's essential that your team uses the right tag for the job. If I can suggest, I'm not necessarily trying to sell you courses, part of it, yes, but as a genuine suggestion for you and your development team, study HTML5. If your team comes from an HTML4, XHTML background, don't assume, it's just an incremental update. No, huge changes. And I am saying changes over here. Changes that are not compatible with previous version of HTML. The semantic behind a lot of tags has been changed. The meaning has been changed. So don't assume that because we've used a tag one way in XHTML 1.1, we can continue using it the same way in HTML5. There's a good chance that yes. And another important point as well is there are new tags. We want to take advantage of those when it comes to structuring our application. We want to make sure it's accessible, and we want to maximize our SEO, search engine optimization. Use the proper tags in HTML5. Right? So if necessary, take training, otherwise take the time to review it or get your team to really immerse themselves in what HTML5 has to offer at the tags. Otherwise, you're missing out. JavaScript, this is where we're getting into programming, and I will throw some JavaScript code at you. I recognize not all of us may be programmers, and that's okay, but I do want to throw some code at you guys, since I want to highlight how different libraries and framework may cause you to structure your application. And these are concerns that we have to keep in mind when we're going to choose what technologies to use to develop our rich modern application. And of course, we're going to hint a little bit at CSS, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on CSS cascading style sheet to present the information visually, to format the information on screen. By the way, HTML5 removed all formatting tags and attributes. Things like the font tag, the big tag, the attribute that allows you to change the font style, that sort of thing, have all been removed in HTML5. CSS is the only way, for multiple good reasons, to format our web application. Now, one of the things that we are getting at is the idea of SPAs, single page application. And we can also talk about MPAs, multiple page application. We'll get to that, but it is a different paradigm. It's I would say, par for the course today when it comes to most web application, where we want to move away from the page-centric view that we're accustomed to, the traditional view of developing web application, to building an application, right? Not a page, but an application. And I think that's hugely important over here. Let's stop looking at developing a web application as being just a collection of pages that we're going to guide the user through. Let's see it more as a desktop application where they fire up the application, interact with it without having to reload the application. So one important facet over here when we get into SPAs is that we want to load all pages at once. though you can lazy load them if desired. There's multiple ways by which we can do that. But the idea over here is we're going to send to the web browser all the pages that a user is expected to interact with. Now, of course, browsers still deal with one page at a time. So we need to have mechanisms to achieve that, fundamentally to show and hide different portion of the page, making it look like we're transitioning from one state to another in the application. Again, we'll talk a little bit about achieving that. No postback. The idea over here is we want to move away from the idea that a user is going to fill out information on a form, say they're logging in, say they're registering, they're filling out an item, whatever the case might be. And once they're done, click submit, send the page to the browser, to the server, get back a new page, and now we start interacting with a new page. I mean, you can, if you want to, of course, use postback, but in the SPA, that would be contrary to what the user would expect. We're going to use server-side APIs instead to interact with the server. So we're not going to send URL Xform URL encoded content, if you're familiar with that. Instead, we're going to use API, typically RESTful JSON type of API. If you're not familiar with that, don't sweat it too much, but I would recommend from a server perspective, we embrace REST architecture. We're not going to get into that in this course because we want to focus on front-end framework. Now, another important change over here, and again, this may require your teams to relearn habits, relearn architectures when it comes to developing application, moving the state to the client, where traditionally the state was stored on the server. Using things, for those of you who are familiar with that, using things like session variables in Java, .NET, PHP, Python, whatever stack you might be using over here, let's get rid of those. Incrementally. I'm not saying you need to go back to work and start wiping out all the wonderful code that you have, but let's move toward stateless architecture, where from HTTP request to HTTP request, we don't maintain state. Everything is done stateless in a RESTful fashion. State instead, what the user is doing, the values they're manipulating, is maintained in the browser, on the client. And there's multiple ways by which we can do that. HTML5 and traditional JavaScript gives you everything we need to do that. We'll talk about different approaches that we can use to maintain state as we go through the different frameworks. And of course, this leads to ideally richer, better integrated and streamlined user experience, but it does add new complexity. And this is why this presentation is important for those of you who are embarking on SPAs, developing your single page application. We need to realize, yes, we are taking on new challenges and we don't want to go it alone. Thus, we're going to adopt frameworks. And we're going to take a look at, again, the three biggest frameworks: Angular, React, and Vue. And there are other ones we could consider using as well out there. So this will add some challenges. Now, there's a word that I've been using over here. I want to make sure we recognize the distinction over here. The word library and the word framework. What the heck is the difference between the two? Well, a library is code that I can use in my application. A good example of that would be jQuery. We'll see a little bit of jQuery later on, and jQuery is an example of a library. Dojo, I'm trying to think of other examples. What's the name? We'll see more examples as we carry along, but those are libraries. Piece of code, functions, if you want to think of it this way, maybe objects that we can use in our application. So instead of us writing that boilerplate code, we can use that boilerplate code that's already been written for us to accelerate some activities, take advantage or simplify some activities. But one of the things about libraries is that it does not impose a structure. You organize your code as you see fit, which has both advantages and disadvantages. We'll talk about that as we carry along. So that's going to bring us to frameworks. what the heck is a framework? What's the difference between the two? Well, a framework provides a foundation to host your code. So it will dictate the structure of your application. You're not going to be able to choose how I want to structure my application. You're not going to be given that capability. But that's both a good and potentially a bad thing, but generally, I will say a good thing. Another thing as well, typically about framework, is that they will require a build before we can execute them. A build in development and a build in production. What do I mean by that? Well, as we write the code for the framework, choose our framework, Angular, Vue, React will be the three examples we're going to look at. We are going to have to compile, and I'll come back to what I mean by compile the code so that we can run it in the browser. It's going to be JavaScript or potentially TypeScript, but we still have a compilation stage. And when it comes to putting it in production, we have a different compilation stage. And I'll talk about this one a little bit as well, where we want to optimize the code. Because as we've discussed earlier, when it comes to SPAs, one of the challenges we need to be able to address over here is the idea that all pages are loaded at once. And that's one challenge we want to be aware of, is that we are throwing a lot more code, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and potentially other resources to the web browser. And we want to make it so that the application can come up as quickly as possible on the user's machine. Make sure that they don't have to twiddle their thumb while they're waiting for the application to be streamed from the web browser, from the web server to the web browser. So that's something to be aware of. And those frameworks will typically provide you with a build stage, which will give you the chance to create a production build, an optimized build for production, squish down the size of the code, optimize the number of HTTP requests we'll have to do, and also package multiple resources together. They pretty much all support that, and I think that's a very important capability over here. And in terms of structure, they're generally an MV whatever, model view whatever. It depends on the framework itself, and most frameworks give you the idea of a model, give you the idea of a view, and then whatever you want to tie the two together. Do you want to use a model view controller? Do you want to use a model view view model? Do you want to use a model view presenter? You choose, right? So most of the time you can choose how you want to tie your business domain to your presentation. And we'll see some of that as we carry on. So SPA challenges. So some of the things we have to be cognizant of before we get to the code. First one is, of course, page size. It will make your page bigger. Instead of sending smaller page one at a time to the browser, we do have to send fundamentally all the code. But we have techniques like lazy loading where we can send them part of the code so they can get started with that code, and in the background or on demand provide the remaining code for the page. And again, that depends on the framework that we use. Search engine optimization is a traditional concern when developing SPA, single page application, though Google, Bing, Yahoo, they'll recognize today that most web pages will be SPAs, and they will index it accordingly. They'll actually load the page, run it locally on their own machine, see how it renders, see what it does, and use that for optimization. But the basic rule of SEOs remain the same. Good, clean code, reasonable load time. The faster your page comes up, the happier Google and Facebook or Bing and Yahoo and whoever else out there will be. And of course, choosing the right tags, choosing the right verbiage for your site will all continue to become essential. But we have to be careful of SEO. Client and server code partitioning. Now, this is another reality where we're going to be developing a client in JavaScript or maybe TypeScript. And there's alternative language we could consider using. But there's a good chance that on the server, we're going to consider using our more traditional programming language, maybe ASP.NET, C#, maybe Java through Spring Boot or JEE. And there's other languages we could use as well, PHP, Python, Ruby, Node. But one advantage of Node is we would stick with the same programming language, same domain, JavaScript. But the important part over here is there typically will be a stronger partitioning between the two, as opposed to traditional, let's say, Java web development, where we write our code and our logic in Java, and then we emit presentations via JSPs. It's all bundled together. Now we have that separation. Where Java, or whatever language you want to use, will provide APIs that the front end will use, but the front end will typically be written in JavaScript. So two sets of skills. To a bit of dilution, we're going to dissolve or dilute our skills a little bit over here between two domains. If you want to minimize dilution, and if you want to even get into code sharing between the two, the client and the server, minimal code sharing, consider using Node.js to write your server-side code, which is what I'll be using for my demos. Browser history is another big one. The back forward button. We don't want to break that. All right. Now, all modern frameworks, SPA frameworks, support that in the sense that as the user is interacting with something, they're filling out information, next brings them to a different view, not a different page. We're still on the same page, but a different view. The browser doesn't know that, all right? And if the user continues to interact with that, next, yet again, another view. The user sees that, but again, the browser doesn't know that. So the challenge over here is what happens if the user clicks the back button? Well, the browser doesn't know that we changed the view twice. So what the browser is going to do is going to bring them to the previous page they were at before they entered the SPA. Meaning that at this point, not only are they completely out of the SPA, but there's a good chance as well that they've lost whatever client-side state they were working on. So back, forward, bookmarking, setting up favorite is another challenge that we have to be aware of as well, where if we're navigating through an SPA and I see, oh, that's really useful, I like to be able to come back to that page often, bookmark. Well, I'm just bookmarking the URL to the SPA, not necessarily the page that I'm on right now. Now, the technology is there with HTML5 and all SPA frameworks, so Angular, React, Vue, and the other ones, they all support what we call routing. So you can allow a user to navigate through an SPA, hit the back button, forward button, bookmark pages without breaking the application, without breaking the paradigms of the web. All right, but this is a concern. Analytics is another one as well, where traditional web analytics, we take a look at which pages open by who, when, what flow they might have used. But because we're no longer using page by page by page flow, it becomes more difficult to keep track of the usage of our application. So there's two common approaches we could consider using for that. The first one is integrate usage analytics right in our application and have usage analytics being sent to our servers to determine, okay, well, they navigated to that page, they clicked that button, they did this, they did that. All right, but this would require you to typically use a library to regularly issue to your server the activities that the users are doing with your application, because otherwise, again, as they move from page to page, the server's never involved. Another approach, or a complementary approach, it doesn't have to be one or the other, but another approach over here is to apply analytics on our server based on the APIs that are being used, which should help us determine what flow they're using through the application. So whatever RESTful endpoints are being used, how they're being used, tracking conversations through those RESTful endpoints, it gives us a chance over here to get a sense of how our applications are actually utilized. One more point over here for SPAs, typically one of the things that we'll need to do, especially to support browser history, is replace 404 errors with index.html on your server. It doesn't matter what server you're using, IIS, Apache, Wildfly, this can easily be configured on all servers. But the idea over here is to support browser history, to allow the user to load the SPA from any URL on the server. If an HTTP request comes in and it would normally respond with a 404, we want to intercept that and respond instead with a 200 with the index.html to allow the SPA, single page application, to be loaded from any path. All right, but this is a server-side configuration. It's not something we can configure on the browser. But let's move ahead. Let's talk about our first potential option to creating a create a web application, an SPA. And the first option would be, hey, let's just use raw technology, raw JavaScript. First bullet, I'm not going to shy away from that, not recommended. Academically, yeah, it can be kind of fun trying to see how things are done raw, getting a sense of how React and Angular and those frameworks do their magic, but please do not do that. All right, there's no excuse. It will lead to a lot of boilerplate code, lots of repetitive code sprinkled all over your application. There is going to be lack of consistency in how we do things. And by the same token, best practices may not be enforced. React, Angular, Vue, they all directly or indirectly enforce best practices. Here, you might say, well, we'll enforce our best practices, but you're not taking advantage of what tens, hundreds, millions of developers around the world are contributing back towards best practices. So let's take advantage of the lessons learned from thousands of developers, tens of thousands of developers around the world utilizing those frameworks. All right. So lack of consistency, also difficult to maintain long term. That's another caveat as well, where it's our code, all that boilerplate code, all that repetitive code that we've put over here will become our responsibility. I can see this question over here, is raw JavaScript also called vanilla JavaScript? You are correct. Both terms could be used interchangeably. They mean the same thing over here. We're going to use vanilla JavaScript. We're not going to use a framework to do things. There are articles out there, especially in relationship to jQuery, that says, go ahead and abandon jQuery. Look at what you can do with raw JavaScript. I'm going to speak against those articles. Practically speaking, no, you're not going to gain. All right, and I can talk about that. I can talk to that for sure as we carry along. And you just have to read those articles, especially those that gives you, here's how you would do it in jQuery, here's how you would do it in vanilla JavaScript. Same thing, right? No. You've got your jQuery code, you've got your JavaScript code. jQuery, JavaScript. No, it's not comparable. You could argue that the JavaScript code might be faster, lighter by maybe nanoseconds, milliseconds. In other words, the difference is really going to be negligible. Chances are your users will never see that difference over here, but instead you'll be investing a lot more in writing code. So going back to that, I know that's not exactly what we're asking about when it comes to the question, is raw JavaScript also called vanilla JavaScript? But just in case you stumble on one of those articles that says, no, you don't need jQuery, you can do the same with vanilla JavaScript. Take that with a strong grain of salt. And we'll talk about that. I want to come back to that as we talk about choosing JavaScript libraries. And it's also going to bring us to the last point over here, reinvent the wheel. If you decide, well, I'm just going to build my own little framework over here to do kind of sort of what Struts does, or not Struts, Angular or React or whatever else does over here, but I'm going to do it better. It's going to be lighter. It's going to be better suited for my work. Well, a couple of things to consider when it comes to that. Is the value proposition of your development effort to create a JavaScript framework? Is that how you are going to deliver business value? And I'm going to go on a limb over here and assume that the answer is no. Our value proposition over here will be to deliver business value. The earlier we can deliver business value, the better. The less expensive it is, the better it is. So if we decide to start recreating our own JavaScript frameworks, we are adding additional work to our team. And it's not just a matter of writing the code. We also need to test the code. So we're going to increase the complexity of our tests. So it's going to take longer to develop, and it's going to take longer to test. There's going to be more effort dedicated in the development of that framework than delivering business value. And finally, recognize that you'll have to maintain the darn thing. All right, bugs will creep in. It's unavoidable. All right, and I'm not saying your development team is not good, but no matter how good of a programmer you are, bugs will creep in. You need to maintain those. You need to test them. Security. I mean, those frameworks were built with security in mind. Do you really have a team whose security experience and knowledge exceeds that of Google or Facebook or Microsoft? And again, I'm not necessarily doubting the capability of your teams, but realistically speaking, we're probably not there yet. But I'm going to use raw JavaScript over here as a starting point. What I'd like to show you over here is a bit of an application, a hello world type of application over here. Actually, let me crack it open right now. So here's the application itself. I'll just do one more reload, make sure everything is good. I can put in a name over here. What is your name? JF. And it says, hello, JF. It is whatever time. All right, now to make the Hello World application a little bit more interesting, it actually uses Ajax. Let's go to the network tab over here. It says an HTTP request, sends a payload over here, so a JSON payload with the name, and we get back as a response a JSON payload giving us the time and the message that we're displaying down here. All right, so there is client-side interactivity. That's about the extent of the complexity I want to tackle with you guys today. All right, we could get in much more complex example, and if necessary, we can certainly discuss much more complex example, but I do want to keep it maintainable or at a level that we can manage for now. So here's my starter application. What does the code look like? Let's actually switch over here to the code. I'll just switch to my presentation mode, boom. And let's take a look at the raw JavaScript application. I'll begin with the HTML. And again, I don't want to turn this necessarily into a programming course, but I do want to take a look at some code with you. So the first part over here, that should be straightforward HTML for us over here. If you have any questions, let me know. Here's where most of the action takes place. The what is your name, the input type text. I'll move the button over here on the next line so you can see it. There's the OK button, and there's the place where I want to drop in my message, the message that we receive from the server. Now, to keep things clean and follow best practices, you will notice over here, I did not include any of the JavaScript in here. Instead, the JavaScript is imported. Here's the JavaScript code itself. Now, I did write the JavaScript code using modern practices. All right, you'll notice over here, for those of you who are familiar with this, I'm using a self-invoking anonymous function. If you're not familiar with that, don't worry about it. I'm also adding an event handler for the load when the page is fully loaded. Here's the initialization code to execute. And in here, there's fundamentally two pieces of business logic, which I kind of muddled together over here. I'm going to retrieve my command greet button. That is, there go this button over here, button ID command greet. And I'm going to add an event listener over here. When the button is clicked, here's the code to execute. Raw JavaScript code, modern JavaScript code over here. I'm going to extract the field name, which is the input type text over here, ID field name. So let's get the field name. Let's extract the value that the user typed in, the name. I'm going to put that into a JSON payload, really a JavaScript payload at this point. So one key, which will be the name. And then I'm going to use the fetch API, the JavaScript fetch API. All modern browsers support that, to send a request to /hello, which we've seen over here, there /hello. That was the HTTP request. I'm going to send a post request. Here's the JSON payload over here. I'm going to convert it to a string. That's going to be the name that the user types in. I'm also going to include content type application JSON, so the server recognizes it is a JSON payload, not a URL XForm encoded payload over here. We're going to wait for the response. We're going to wait for the JSON payload, so convert the response to a JSON payload, and then get the label message, which is that paragraph down here, and finally set its inner text to be the text that we receive back from the server, right? That's a raw JavaScript example. Balancing over here, modern approaches, keeping the code clean and reasonably straightforward over here, and again, taking advantage of modern JavaScript. If I was using older browsers over here, one of the big change I would have done is I would have replaced my fetch over here with an XML HTTP request object, and I would have probably had to forego the await over here and replace that with callbacks instead. But that's raw JavaScript. No jQuery, no Angular, no nothing over here. We've seen it in action, so we know that the code works. Do you guys have any questions for me at this point? All right. So let's move to our first piece of technology we're going to look at, jQuery. It's the most popular JavaScript library out there. It's used by over 70% of all websites. Certainly the top 10,000 websites, if not 100,000, use jQuery in one form or another, widely adopted in the industry. The goal of jQuery, it's a library, not a framework, but it's to deal with DOM transversal and manipulation. What the heck is DOM? Stands for Document Object Model. And what this is, it's the structure of our web page, right, as we have it in a browser. We refer to that as the DOM, the Document Object Model. So starting with our root HTML element, the head, the body, my heading, my form, paragraphs, input, button, etc. These are all part of the DOM. So the goal of jQuery is really twofold. You can say threefold, but DOM traversal, selecting elements in the DOM, like I'm doing in my code right now. All right, document, get element by ID. I'm selecting something in the DOM. These are the only API really I'm using. Get element by ID, get element by ID. There's three of those, but there's other APIs I could use as well. And manipulation. After I've selected an object, I want to manipulate it. So for example, when I select my command greet over here, I want to add an event handler. When the user clicks on that button, here's the code to execute. I'm doing the same thing over here. I'm extracting the field name from my DOM, and I'm extracting the value that the user typed in. Here, I'm getting the label message paragraph, and I'm extracting, or I'm setting its inner text, changing the text inside the paragraph. So these are examples of DOM manipulation. Very simple example. We could get into much more sophisticated example, creating elements and changing elements, changing attributes, not difficult to do, but the code would get even more verbose. All right, and again, I do want to emphasize, for those of you who are given an article saying, hey, you don't need jQuery anymore because you can do everything without jQuery, here's an example of doing it without jQuery. Here's fundamentally the same code with jQuery. Between the two, which one do you think would be easier to write, faster to write? All right, now the code may seem a little bit more cryptic, but I mean, it's night and day comparing the two pieces of code over here. They achieve the same darn thing, but much less code, all right? So again, don't let the naysayer come up to you and say, you don't need jQuery, go with the raw JavaScript API. If you are going to go with libraries, not frameworks, I strongly recommend have a library, jQuery or otherwise. Yes, you can do everything with raw JavaScript, but expect much more code. And if they tell you, well, it's going to be so much faster, ask them to prove it, right? If it's going to be much faster, we're talking about milliseconds. That's not going to make a difference. You'll be wasting time and effort writing more code, testing more code for a couple of milliseconds that users will never notice, right? So I do want to emphasize that. So when it comes to the jQuery version, I can show it to you in action. And by the way, I'll make all that code available for you if you want to take a look at the examples, the raw code itself. I'll make that all available for you at the end. Let me demonstrate over here. So I'll make that JF. What is your name? Okay. Hello, JF. It is whatever. But this time, if I take a look at my source, it is my jQuery code. We can see over here those $signs that we see so often in jQuery code. And if we switch to the network tab, we can see that was an HTTP request to the same endpoint over here. We sent a payload. Actually, it should be JSON, but name equals JF over here. That's my payload. And the response is, again, that JSON payload over here with the message, hello, JF, it is whatever time over here. So that gave us a chance over here to see a little bit of jQuery in action. But I do want to emphasize a couple of things when it comes to working with jQuery. It's a nice library. I'm not going to, certainly not going to shy away from it. I've used jQuery for probably a decade and a half myself. I still love working with it. I am finding myself moving away from jQuery, moving and adopting SPA framework. So jQuery is a library, so it's not going to tell me how to write the code, but it will provide a foundation on which I'm going to write my code. I shouldn't even say a foundation, but APIs that I could use to write my code. The APIs are exposed via the jQuery object, which is a $sign. Now, one thing to recognize over here is that every library we're going to look at doesn't do any magic. They cannot do anything that JavaScript and CSS and HTML cannot do out of the box. All right, so they wrap themselves around existing capabilities. And one of the mystifying aspect of jQuery over here is, what is that $sign? Where does that come from over here? That weird symbol that we use with jQuery. Well, that's actually a JavaScript thing, and we'll see that here and there with other libraries. But the $sign in JavaScript really has no meaning. It's actually one of the very rare component of JavaScript that's really inherited from the Java programming language. When the Java programming language was created, Java 1.0, 1.1, by design, the creators of the Java programming language adopted a variant on the traditional approach when it comes to naming identifiers, things like naming classes, variables, methods, whatever else, where in pretty much all programming language that you guys might be familiar with, if you're not a programmer, that's okay, but in all programming languages, when it comes to naming a variable, we normally have to start the variable name with a letter or an underscore. Both are valid. And following that, we can use any combination of letters, numbers, and underscore to name our variable. 99% of all programming languages use that foundation when it comes to naming stuff. Java added the $sign as a letter. So from a Java perspective, and I'm talking Java, not JavaScript over here, in Java, if you name a variable, let's say a $sign, doesn't mean anything special. $sign A doesn't mean anything special. They're two different variable names. I could name it class $sign. It would be valid. So the $sign is just a letter. All right, that's the way Java sees it. And the rationale in the Java world was because Java often relies on compiler-generated code and code that may be generated here and there, even at runtime. When code is generated by the compiler, we're typically going to throw $ in the identifier. So we use that to determine was that code that was written by a human being, or was that code that was written by the compiler or some kind of compiler. That was the rationale, and it's still heavily used today in Java. But you don't see that because that's not code that you would normally see directly yourself. It's generally today done at runtime. In JavaScript, when JavaScript was renamed JavaScript, they wanted to give it more of a Java flavor. And one of the things that they've adopted was the standard in Java that we could use $ as a regular letter. But because JavaScript, especially in its early days, didn't rely so much on code generation, that $ wasn't used for anything until the author of jQuery, and I do apologize, I forget his name, but the original author of jQuery over here, as he was looking for an identifier for his libraries, he looked at different things. What about jQuery? Which is valid, by the way. I could replace the $ with jQuery, but it's long to type. What about underscore? All right, but it's hard to see. It's easy to miss. Using JQ doesn't really stand out much. It looks like a temporary variable until, as he was reviewing JavaScript standard, he found that, oh, you can name things with $. Nobody had used $ in JavaScript really since before then. So he started using the $ as the identifier for his library. And the rest is history over here. I would not say that this is what allowed jQuery to become the phenomenal success that it is today. The design of the library had a lot to do with it, but also that cleverness of using the $ as the entry point to the JavaScript library. And there's two ways by which we can use it. I'm going to get a little bit more technical. I can use it as a function, $ round brackets. I'm calling code over here, $ round bracket, $ round brackets. I'm using it as a function, or I can use it as an object, $ dot, and then access a member, like the post function, which I'll talk about later on. So this is recognizably jQuery code. And I'm not going to dissect the full code over here, but somebody who knows jQuery, even superficially, would most likely be able to read this code and understand pretty quickly what I'm doing. Here, I'm running a selector. So I'm selecting a node. Remember that jQuery is two things. I said count sort of three things. We'll get to the third thing. But we said that jQuery is a DOM traversal and manipulation. Here, I'm traversing my DOM. Give me an element that has the ID command greet. That's what the pound means over here. It's fundamentally CSS selectors, if you're familiar with that. So give me command greet over here, the button, dot, click, add an event handler. When the button is clicked, here's the code I want to use. And that's an example over here of manipulation. Another example, select the field name, the element that has the field name, the ID field name, and give me the value the user entered over here. Here's one more example. Select the label message, the element that has the ID label message, and set the text of the element to be the message of the response. So this is an example of both selecting an element, doing DOM traversal, and then manipulating those elements. Now, there's a lot more I would love to show you when it comes to doing those manipulations. And let me try maybe one more example over here. One of the things I'm going to do over here, let me go to the index.html. I'll make a paragraph hidden. And when we set the text, let's animate that as well. So I'm going to chain together two operations, set the text, then animate it. Let's see if we can view this visually. I'm going to put in, say, JF. Okay. And hopefully you've seen this. It actually slid down. I'm going to run that again over here. Okay. slides down over here. If that's too fast, I can slow down the animation. Let's make it over 5 seconds. Reload. And now hopefully you'll see that reasonably well. We can see there's some animation. I could have controlled the animation, use different animation, but hey, I was able to do that just by adding, 7 keystrokes to my code, right? And that's an example again of jQuery. Yes, you could do that with raw JavaScript. It's going to take you a lot more than 7 keystrokes to achieve. All right. So before we move ahead, I want to get into Bootstrap and I want to get into other framework, but I'm looking at the time. It's 11:15. We've been going at it for about an hour and 15 minutes. I'm going to suggest let's have a bit of a break, give you guys a chance to walk around, refresh yourselves. How about we resume 11:30 Eastern Standard Time? Does that sound good for you guys? I'll take that as a yes. All right. So have yourselves a good break. We'll resume 11:30 Eastern Standard. Hey, it's just about 11:30. I'm assuming you guys had a chance to enjoy a bit of a break. Can you guys hear me okay? Could let me know via the chat window, question window. Just want to confirm everything's good. Back, yes, excellent. Thank you very much. All right, so this morning, so far, we were talking about the evolution of web application, bringing us to where we are presently, the idea of SPA, single page application. I mean, you don't need to go into the SPA world. It's many sites will use MPAs where they'll have multiple applications with dependencies linked from application to application in between. That's perfectly okay when it comes to that. And again, it doesn't mean you actually have to go with SPAs. You could continue to work with traditional server-generated web pages, but that is becoming a bit antiquated when it comes to developing web application, especially if we want to enhance the user experience and even limit the amount of traffic, network traffic, we could achieve that thanks to SPAs. But we also started talking about, well, raw JavaScript, contrasting that with jQuery. And I think the contrast was self-evident over here. The amount of code that I needed to write in jQuery was much lesser than raw JavaScript, since jQuery as a library takes care of a lot of concerns that we have when it comes to developing applications, basically doing DOM manipulation. And also, by the same token, one last thing I actually had not mentioned in here is the idea of doing a post request, transforming what was a couple of line of code previously. Let's go back to the request itself. So that's pretty much the entire request in raw JavaScript. In jQuery, I was able to bring it down to just one line. So I think that's these are important considerations for us over here. You guys have been asking questions. I'm hoping you'll carry that up as we carry along. Now, what I'd like to do over here is move to our next example over here. Here I have my jQuery example. If I go back to my raw example, they're fundamentally identical. I'm not using any CSS, and jQuery doesn't worry about CSS. Yes, you can integrate CSS if you want to, but it's not a requirement. Now let's get started with Bootstrap. And there's actually two versions of Bootstrap I'd like to discuss, 4 and the upcoming 5. So let me just crack open the Bootstrap version, and immediately you will notice, whoop, the look has changed. The HTML is fundamentally the same. If I can take a look at both over here, toggle back and forth, I think you can see that the Bootstrap is a little bit sharper, crisper, more modern in terms of its approach. And of course, we can make it fancier, but right off the bat, it has changed. So what is Bootstrap? Let's go back to the presentation. Bootstrap is a CSS framework, first and foremost. So it's not really a JavaScript thing, but I did want to include it in here for two reasons. First one is a lot of people, when they get started with web development, they ask me, should I consider using Bootstrap? Should I use jQuery or Bootstrap? A common question that I get asked over here. Well, there's a chance you'll want to use both. So it's a CSS framework for responsive, mobile-first front-end web development. JavaScript's actually optional, but version 4 requires jQuery. Version 5 does not require jQuery, but version 5 is in alpha, maybe in beta right now. I'd have to check. It was originally developed by Twitter and continues to be sponsored heavily by Twitter. But the keyword over here is CSS framework for responsive, mobile-first front end. And we could spend a day or two just getting started with Bootstrap. I don't want to make it sound like it's complex and big. There's a lot to it, but the idea over here is provide responsive web design, which implies fundamentally, if I can kind of distill the meaning behind it, which implies that we're first going to develop our website for the lowest common denominator, for example, mobile device, and scale it up accordingly. Instead of doing it the other way, which unfortunately is still commonly done, where we're going to start by developing it for desktop devices, For example, the developer is going to run it on their big, massive screen over here, and then figure out, okay, how can we squish down the UI to fit on a mobile device? Let's do it the other way around. Start mobile and then scale up. And Bootstrap is built specifically for that. If I can highlight for you the code, there's not much to show you actually. If I can go to Bootstrap code, take a look at the HTML. Here's the HTML. You will notice over here I am using Bootstrap JavaScript bundles. I am using the Bootstrap CSS, and there's variants you could use as well. Not going to get into those, but if you have any questions, please don't be shy. And you will also notice that I am including jQuery at the top. I mean, if I take a look at this demo, everything looks good. If I were to temporarily remove jQuery, I'll just comment out that line, refresh, I'll actually get a couple of errors now, not just in my code, because my code does require jQuery, but it's going to tell me over here, Bootstrap's JavaScript requires jQuery. jQuery must be included before Bootstrap's JavaScript. So jQuery is a requirement with Bootstrap 4. Now, the reality is, though jQuery is still the most popular JavaScript library out there, its popularity is waning. Why? Not because there's a direct replacement to jQuery, but the reason is we're moving away from libraries, moving towards frameworks, which we'll talk about very soon. All right, and because frameworks like Angular, Vue, that sort of thing, you normally don't want to use jQuery with those. It would just get in the way of the framework. We want to use those instead of jQuery. So to continue to modernize Bootstrap, Bootstrap 5 now can run without jQuery. I mean, the HTML is going to be identical to what we have over here. Whoops, looks like the integration was not completed. But when it comes to Bootstrap 5, you don't need jQuery for that to run. Though the code, if you're wondering about the JavaScript code, I'm still using jQuery. So Bootstrap doesn't, well, it adds a couple of functionality, but not enough to really distinguish what we're doing over here. So should we use Bootstrap? Well, quite honestly, if you are getting into responsive web design, you want to be able to develop an application that looks modern, looks sharp, yet can work on different form factor, learning Bootstrap would certainly be worthwhile. It's not the only option out there, though realistically it is the most commonly used option when it comes to doing that, but there are alternatives, even drop-in replacements you could consider using instead of Bootstrap. We'll talk about some of those alternatives later on, but be aware that Bootstrap, well, is the most popular responsive CSS framework out there. But now let's switch gears. We've talked about Bootstrap. Now let's get started with the three big framework. What are they? Angular, and actually I do apologize, should not read AngularJS, should really just read Angular. Why? We'll talk about that. It says JavaScript-based open source front-end web framework mainly maintained by Google. So this actually comes from Google. And if there's somebody that knows how to create SPAs, it's Google. I mean, the Google search engine, Google Map, Gmail, Google Doc. These are highly influential SaaS, software as a service, SPAs, single page applications out there in the industry. So we cannot deny the success of Google when it comes to developing such application. And Angular reflects a lot of their lessons learned and continues to be one of the leading framework that is used to create single page application. And actually might as well say that Angular was the first real framework that was developed specifically to develop SPA, with the idea, the mentality of developing SPA. It is a component-based framework, which means that as a programmer, I'm going to be writing components. And there's different type of components. I'll give you examples. It's part of the mean stack, which stands for MongoDB, Express.js, Angular, and Node. Actually, I'm using all of that in my demo with the exception of MongoDB. I'm not using a database for my demo, but my code over here, my server-side code, is using Express and Node to provide my simple API, my Hello API that I've shown you over here. And one of the facet of Angular over here is what we call two-way binding, where you've got your model, you've got your view. If your view modifies a value, your model gets updated. If your model modifies a value, your view is updated. So we've got a binding, an implicit binding between the two, and I'll demonstrate that very soon as we carry along. Angular is also said to be a heavyweight framework, meaning that it does require a lot of code to run, right? If you compare an Angular application to a React application to a Vue application, you'll typically find that a code that gets generated with Angular will be bigger, right? If I were to compare the code that was generated with my Angular app versus my Hello World Angular app, my Hello World React app, and my Hello World Vue app, Angular would be the biggest. So at first it may seem like, ooh, I'm not sure I want to use Angular, it's going to make my application fat. But one of the reasons why it's a little bit bigger is that it comes with a lot of batteries included, a lot of functionalities that are not readily available out of the box with the alternatives out there. All right, so that's one important point. I'm not going to be able to demonstrate what I mean by some of that functionality, but it was designed with common web flows, common use cases in mind to implement, to support those common use cases. And that's very important for us over here. I like to think that this is one of the winning features of Angular over here, though at first it may look like it's fat. Well, the reason is, if you were to rewrite an equivalent real-world-ish application with the alternative, with equivalent functionality, especially at the level of forms, the code will probably amount to the same. Either you'll be using plugins with these other frameworks to achieve the same level of functionality, or writing a lot of code that may already be available for you in Angular, right? So be aware that Angular may seem bigger, and some people may complain about that, but we also have to consider the additional functionality that is pre-baked in it. It doesn't strive to be light, it strives to be complete, so different mentality. One more aspect about Angular, and the reason why I'm not happy with having put AngularJS, and that's entirely my fault over here, I will correct that before we send out the slide for you guys, is because there is two versions of Angular. There's AngularJS, which obviously stands for JavaScript, and then you've got Angular 2 and above. AngularJS refers to Angular 1.0. Angular 1.0 was written in JavaScript. When the Angular team started working with Angular 2, they abandoned JavaScript in favor of TypeScript. What is TypeScript? If you've never heard of TypeScript before, be aware that it's a superset of the JavaScript programming language, meaning that all JavaScript code is valid TypeScript code. Of course, the opposite is not true. Browsers only speak JavaScript. They don't speak TypeScript. So to be able to run TypeScript code in a browser, we first have to compile our TypeScript code to JavaScript. Not a big deal. We'll talk about how this is done, but this is usually done automatically for us in development, and TypeScript just recompiles to vanilla JavaScript code. But the advantage that we have with TypeScript is more expressive and type-safe code, which is something we don't have with JavaScript. And let me jump into the demonstration. Talk a little bit about the code. I don't want to get too technical, but I will throw some TypeScript code at you guys, get a sense of the library over here. So let me switch over here to the Angular demo. There we go. So it's identical to what we've seen previously. Click OK. Hey, there we go. I get my response back. You can see I am running Angular over here. I did get a message telling me I'm running Angular. If I can take a look at my network. network tab. Let's move that down. You can see that it was a HTTP request that was sent to my server-side component to generate the message that we see over here. So same logic, except now I'm using Angular. So what does the code look like? Let's take a look at that together. I'm going to close a couple of things over here, and let's crack open Angular. Now, there's a lot more code, a lot more files. I did not write most of those files. They were actually given to me. Actually, I should go into my dev since these are the compiled files. And whoa, that's a lot of files. Actually, most of that I did not write. Instead, I got Angular to generate for me. And I think that's important over here. Angular, when we start an Angular project, we don't want to start in a vacuum. We're going to get Angular, and there's a command to do that, ng create or ng init, I forget the command itself, that will create the project for me. It will lay out all those files. Now, I'm not going to go into what each and every one of those files are about, but I will go into the source. All right, and this is really my application under app. And let me go into, actually, I'll begin with my HTML, index.html, because that's my entry point for my application. If you take a look at this, it's raw HTML, but I don't see my form in here. I don't see the form that says, what is your name, the OK button, the hello label at the top. I'm not seeing that. Instead, in the body, I'm seeing this component over here called app-root. What the heck is that? Well, as we said earlier, Angular is component-based. It's heavily modularized, and that's actually a good thing. Modularize your code, all right? Work in a more object fashion, if you want to think of it this way. So app-root is actually in this file, actually a combination of 3 files, app component TS, not JS. So that's a TypeScript file, not a JavaScript file. Now, ignore those errors over here, simply because I deleted my nodes module folder as I transfer the code over. But the code works. I've demonstrated for you guys. And what I'd like to show you over here is, well, this is TypeScript code, not JavaScript, though most of it would work in JavaScript. There's a couple of things that I would have to refine over here. I actually have 2 classes. I'm not going to worry about that too much, but I'm getting into more structured code, a class to send a request to the server, a class to get a response back from the server. Here's the component. We're getting into what we call decorators over here. You'll notice that there's a selector app-root, which is what fundamentally binds this tag to this component. I could have renamed it, but I stuck with the default for now. There's also mention of template URL, style URL. I'll come back to that. And here I have a class. Now, most of you, if you have a bit of a programming background, have probably worked with classes in Java, .NET, whatever language you might be using. Here's a class in C#, or you could have been a JavaScript class. This class has 2 fields, name, message, which are initialized to nothing right now. There's a constructor, takes 1 parameter, but really does nothing. We'll come back to this one later on. And then here's the only code that I have, a function called greet, which I'll dissect with you guys later on. 3 lines of code. There's not a heck of a lot. There's a lot of declaration over here, but functionally, there's only 3 lines of code. The rest is, you could say, boilerplate, but we'll come back there. There's all use for those. But now some of you may be wondering, okay, where's the hello label? Where's the what's your name, the text box, the button? They're actually stored in a separate file, similar to what we do normally with standalone JavaScript application. We want to keep the HTML and the JavaScript separate. So in my source app folder, there's app component.html. Here it is. Looks familiar? There's my hello, what's your name, my input, my button, my message. Notice, however, that it's not quite true HTML. There's that weird construct, square bracket, round bracket, angular model equals name. And here I've got double mustache over here, message closing double mustache. What the heck is that? Well, you'll notice over here that name, message, and there's another funky one over here, round bracket, click equals greet, name, greet, message. They all refer to elements of my app component. There's the name variable, there's the message variable, there's the greet function. So that's an example of binding over here. It's a two-way binding, meaning that whatever changes I do in my code, for example, I'll change the name to, let's say, JF. Oh, I'll need to do that. Nah, it's not going to work over here. I would have to recompile the code. But if I were to refresh that page, the default name would be JF. And the idea over here is when I change it over here, that variable also gets changed. So two-way binding between what the user sees and what your code has in memory. We also understand just by looking at this, there's my button, round bracket, click equals greet. So here's the code, in this case, the function I want to execute when we click the OK button. And if I can take a look at that code quickly with you guys over here, async greet, taking advantage of asynchronous programming in JavaScript, you'll notice that I'm creating a new hello request. What the heck's a hello request? It's that class. I'm just doing this for convenience to provide some structure to my code. I didn't have to do that. That's my JSON payload, which has one field, which is the name. That's it. So I'm creating a JSON payload with the name. I could have done it this way as well. It would have worked. That, actually, I should really do it this way. That would have worked as well. Just use a raw JavaScript object, no problem. Following that, I use this.http. Where the heck does that HTTP come from? Well, this is the object, the wrapper for Ajax that Angular provides for us. Now, if I can go back to something I mentioned earlier, remember I said that Angular comes with batteries included. And that's a bit of an example over here. In my next two example, React and Vue don't actually come with an HTTP wrapper for you. You're expected to use your own, whatever you want to use, which in a way gives us maybe more flexibility, and in a way less convenience, less consistency, predictability in our code. So we do have this wrapper over here, HTTP, the HTTP client. Where did I get that? Well, I didn't have to create it. It was injected for me in the constructor. So in the constructor, this is where I'm telling React, when you create my app component, give me an instance of the HTTP client, just call it HTTP. This is a combination over here of TypeScript code and Angular magic that we're seeing over here. All right, there's a little, we could spend more time discussing that, but we are getting into an example of CDI, context, and dependency injection, or just DI, dependency injection, right? If you're familiar with, for example, Spring Boot, those type of model, same idea over here. Instead of me creating the resources that I need, I can just request it, and Angular will inject them for me. Very easy, very convenient to do. And one advantage that we have over here when it comes to the HTTP object, when I'm sending a pulse request over here, I can type it using what we call generic. So I'm indicating that I expect to receive a hello response. There it goes. So I've defined a class for that. So I was able to structure my response, the time, the message itself, send a request to the URL, and here's the payload. That's the payload that we have over here. Convert that to a promise. I don't want to use what's it called, RxJS to do that. So convert it to a promise so I can use await. If you're not sure what that is, don't worry about it too much. I want to stick with raw JavaScript. So get the response, and then this dot message. So this dot message is my message that I have over here, my message field. Initialize it to the response that we've got from the server. Now, one of the things I'm not doing, and I do apologize for that, I'm not doing error handling. If I was doing production code, I should be doing error handling. I think we're all cognizant of that, but I should be doing error handling. I'm skipping over that to keep the code simple for now. So I'm setting the message field. Because of two-way binding, it implies that this message placeholder that we have over here, the moment I change the field, boom, the view is updated as well. So that's an example of two-way binding. So the name field, which I am reading over here, the moment the user modifies it in that input, that will update that variable. The moment I update this variable in my code, boom, it updates the output as well. So two-way binding, that's an Angular example over here. So why should I consider using Angular? There's a couple of good reasons to consider using Angular. It's widely used out there in the industry. It's been around for a good long time and continues to be developed and maintained quite aggressively by Google and the open source community. And I mentioned open source, so it is freely available, MIT license, very liberal over here. Very straightforward to get started with. Right? Out of all the frameworks I'm going to show you, is probably the one that for traditional programmers, the one that it would pick up the fastest. All right. Also, it is designed with common web workflows in mind, much less boilerplate code that we need to put in place when it comes to using Angular. It also comes with a rich set of plugins to extend its functionality. It is highly modular, which means that when I compile my application, I compile only what I need. I did say it's fatter, but it can be very lean if I'm careful in what I choose over here in my code. For example, I'm using the HTTP client. That's a module I had to bring in. It's part of Angular, but I had to explicitly bring it in to make sure that the HTTP client is compiled with my application. So there's a number of good reasons to consider using Angular. But I'm not going to talk about why you should not consider using Angular. Instead, let's contrast it to other frameworks that are available for us out there. The next example, we're going to get into React. And this one I was having problems with earlier, so I'm hoping it's still cooperating. Boom, there we go. It's up and running. So here's a React application. So same structure. It's always the same application, but rewritten in different frameworks. So let's take a look at this one together. So React, this one was actually developed by Facebook. And no matter what you think of Facebook, consider the fact that they have one of the biggest sites out there on the internet, some of the most visited site on the internet out there. They know a thing or two about writing complex web applications. It was designed to help you develop either SPAs and or mobile application. There's a version of React called React Native to help you develop mobile application, taking advantage of what React has to offer. React, as the name implies, uses a programming model that we call reactive programming. What does that mean? I'll show it to you. There's two ways to structure a React application, function or class. I could have shown you both approaches, but I'm just going to show you the function approach for a couple of reasons. And React also uses a technology that was developed independently of React called JSX, JavaScript extension for XML. It's actually kind of a neat technology. You'll see it in action very soon. And I did add Redux over here with a big fat exclamation mark because I was excited over here. What the heck is Redux? It is not a part of React. It's actually a different library, a JavaScript library that was developed independently of React. It's a state management library, but the programming model behind React is nicely suited for the Redux state management programming model. So the two go together very naturally hand in hand, right? If you Google React, chances are you'll see Redux. If you Google Redux, chances are you'll see React. They're two separate projects. They are evolving independently. One does not depend on the other, but again, they're commonly used together. Why? I'm not going to use it in my demo over here, but you'll see where Redux would be desirable in my code. So let's take a look at the code for React. So this is my Angular code over here. And again, it looks like there's a lot of code that I wrote. The only change that I've done over here, the only file that I've edited was the app component, and actually app component HTML, app component TypeScript. I did not write all of that. Really, I wrote that portion and created those two classes. So not that much code, all things considered, but nicely structured code. And these I should have put in a separate file, but I wanted to keep everything together. But the code is more structured, easier to maintain. Very important for us. Well, let's take a look at React now. Boom. Again, looks like there's a lot of code. The React project generated that code for me. The only code I had to edit over here was my where is it? app.js. So I'm using raw JavaScript over here. I'm not using TypeScript, though you can use TypeScript with, well, any framework if you want to. So here's the code. Most of it, the vast majority of it, is going to be in that function called app. I could have called it whatever. Actually, before I take a look at this one, let's take a look at our entry point index. Actually, this one is generated. I don't even have an index.html. Though there is an index.js. Let's go to the app over here. Now I'm going to skip over some weird stuff, like what the heck is this use state over here? Update name, I'll come back to that one. Function greet. Actually, if you take a look at the code over here, this is actually those two lines. This is fundamentally my fetch code, await fetch over here, the same code that I've shown you in my raw JavaScript application. React doesn't come with a standard HTTP library, an Ajax library. Instead, you use whatever you want. Axios is often used in React for that. All right. So in my case, I went with raw JavaScript just to keep things reasonably clean. The rest, set state, I'll talk about that dude later on. And here's really the heart of the function. So I am in a function over here, app. There's the return statement, and it's kind of funky. I've got some HTML in here. That's JSX. Now, browsers don't speak JSX. So if I were to try to open that app.js in a web browser, I will get tons and tons of compile error. So I'm not sure how to read that code. So what we need to do over here is we'll need to compile that code to raw JavaScript. And React will take care of that for us. It will actually recompile that code to JavaScript for me. But if you can take a look at this code over here, so I've got a div over here. Actually, I could remove that altogether. That's not important. My hello heading, we've seen that. What is your name? Input value equals, and now I've got some mustache. State dot name. Where the heck does state come from? Defined over here, but I want to come back and talk about what it does. So state dot name. So show me the name over here. On change, so that's a standard JavaScript. Well, no. If you know your JavaScript really well, you might look at this and say, oh, JF, I see a mistake. There should not be a capital C on change. In JavaScript, the event handler to find out, well, any event handler in HTML is always spelled out lowercase, on click, on change, on key press, on mouse move, on whatever. In this case, I got a capital C. Not a mistake on my part. This is a React thing. React's event handler, we're going to use camel case. So first letter is lowercase, remaining words are capitalized. So that's not a mistake. If you've observed that, good for you. If not, don't worry about it. But this is an important distinction between raw JavaScript and React's event model. So you'll notice over here, I'm indicating when the user changes the name, perform an update name. What the heck is update name? Is that function over here. Right? We'll talk about what it does in a moment. Then button on click, again, reasonably self-explanatory, but notice again on click, capital C, not a mistake. If I were to contrast this to, let's say, my raw code over here, actually, I don't have an on click itself, but yeah, let's just use click, so can't contrast directly, but we don't use capital letters in those. Let me go back to my React code. There we go. So on click over here, capital C equals greet. So once again, I want to invoke that function over here. So one of the interesting facets of React is that our template, our HTML code for our components, so similar to Angular, our components, it is a component-based framework, but our component code, we're going to introduce it inside our HTML, inside our JavaScript, I should say. So the HTML will reside inside the JavaScript. Now, there's advantages and a caveat when it comes to doing that. One advantage is we can keep everything together quite nicely. One facet of React, which is very, very different than TypeScript, not TypeScript, Angular, right? React versus Angular, very different programming model. In Angular, two-way binding. If the UI changes, we update the model. If the model changes, we update the UI, two-way binding. In React, we work a little bit differently. We have reactive programming, which implies that when something happens, we execute some code that updates the state. And then we regenerate the UI with the updated state, right? An example of that, which might seem redundant, but important nevertheless, is that input over here. When the user changes the field in the UI, we need to update our state. So we're going to call update name. What does it do? Pardon me. There's one function that I'm calling in here, set state. Where does it come from? I'll get to it. And in here, I'm providing a JavaScript object, a raw JavaScript object, which updates the name and the, the message over here, which will update the name and the message. The message remains the same. Actually, I should have really done the following. If you're not familiar with that operator, that standard JavaScript, but all I'm going to update over here is the name, event target value. So update the name to whatever the user entered. Now, where does that set state come from? Well, let's take a look up above. I'm using a React call, a React call over here called useState. This comes from React. You can see here I'm importing it from React, useState from React. So useState, what does that do? Well, the way that React manages state, there's kind of sort of three approaches, which ultimately amount to the same thing. Either you use the traditional approach, which is what I'm using over here, useState, to provide tools to manage my state, the client state of the application, or you could consider moving towards a more object-oriented approach using classes. More and more people are doing that. Or the third approach would be to consider using Redux, which I hinted at previously. But the way we do that over here in React is that the state is atomic, all or nothing. As opposed to the state in Angular, which are just variables, which could contain some values and sub-values as you see fit. So you could have a graph of value if you wanted to. In the case of React, the state is atomic. When you change the state, you replace the old state with a brand new state. So in this case, the state of my application, the information that my application needs to run, I'm going to store it in one object. There's one state, so I'm going to store it in one object, one JavaScript object over here. And I can change the state at any time. Tell React, okay, we've changed the state of the application. We're going to call set state, which is provided for me over here. If I need to read the state, there's another variable called state, which you'll see me use here and there. For example, state.name, what's the current name for the application, the message itself. Actually, I'm setting the message over here. But here are examples of dealing with the state. So very different programming model than what we might be accustomed to. So at first, it may make you a little bit uncomfortable, especially if you're a programmer yourself looking at this, like, oh, it's not the way I'm accustomed to program application. It might be tempting to default back to working with Angular, working in a more binding type of approach. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. The bad thing, though, would be dismissing React because the programming model may be new to you. The programming model is not new. Reactive programming has been around for a long, long time. Yeah, before the web even. But the idea over here is we want to treat the state atomically. It's one thing. And if we change the state, we replace the old state with the new state. Redux makes that much more convenient. Another approach when it comes to Redux that is enforced by Redux, and I would really recommend you take a look at Redux if you are going to go the React route. Redux also does not just make state management atomic, but also enforces predictable path, entry point through which the state will be modified. And that makes debugging state in an application so much easier, because Redux will ensure that there's one and only one way by which we modify the state, fundamentally by sending messages. It means that we can pretty much eliminate scenarios where all of a sudden, boom, a field changes and we cannot figure out why that field changed. Looking at Redux or even structuring my application this way makes state management so much simpler. Another advantage to that approach, which at first may not be evident, is it works a little bit more in line with the way that we work with the web. The back forward button, for example, when I hit back, when I hit forward, typically I'll also want to bring back the previous state, move up to the succeeding state if we use the forward button. Using Redux also works with that mentality. So it provides an approach that is more in line with the way pages work on a website, the way users are accustomed to think of pages. So very different programming model than what we're accustomed to, but for good reason. And the example that I'm giving you over here cannot really do full justice to React. There's a lot more I could have shown you when it comes to React. We're just getting started with this one, and I know there's a lot of pieces that may be nebulous in terms of what we're doing, but again, very different programming model. React right now, last time I checked, is the most popular JavaScript framework out there for a number of good reasons. It allows us to get typically quality application, highly maintained application done fairly quickly. It's a little bit lighter weight than Angular, but again, you don't get all the goodies that you may get in Angular. The programming model might seem a bit obtuse at first. It requires some getting used to. So your teams will need to familiarize themselves with React should we choose to go that route, but its success is undeniable. And one of the cool part of React as well that I do want to emphasize over here is the idea of JSX, where I can introduce my template right here in my code. I think that's a really cool feature of React, not having that artificial separation. I mean, a separation is not necessarily a bad thing, but one of the things that I find a little bit tedious sometimes when I'm working with Angular is when I'm editing my code over here. Let me go to my application. There you go. I'm going to edit my code over here. Now I need to update the view. I need to switch to the file and then go back to my code. So ping-ponging back and forth between those files. Again, it's not a terrible thing. Technically, I could have put my code in a string in here, but that would be ugly, very difficult to maintain. So no, we're not going to do that. So I'll let you decide what you prefer from that point of view. Should we have the template, the view with the logic? Should we keep them separate? And again, for those of you who are going back to the days of ASPs, PHPs, even JSPs, where we got into the habit of mixing logic and presentation, I do want to emphasize that with React, we are not doing that. The presentation is its own portion of that file. We keep the two separate, together in the same file, but distinct from one another. We don't put JavaScript code inside the presentation. Just wanted to emphasize that. So that said, there's one more I'd like to look at with you, which is Vue.js. Now, personally, that's my personal opinion. This is actually my favorite. Right? I'm not saying that it is inherently superior to React or Angular. Right? There's advantages to all three, but this is the one I personally have a lot of fun working with. It's an open source model view model JavaScript framework for building user interfaces and single page application. And I find the support for MPAs, multiple page application, also very solid in Vue. I really appreciate that in Vue. It's component based, similar to React and Angular. Templates are stored in Vue file. That's another thing I think is really cool about Vue. There's actually different ways by which you can create your components, but a Vue file is really standard HTML, which means that I can open that in just about any tools that can read HTML and JavaScript, and they'll be able to parse it. I don't need special tools to read, for example, JSX. Right? My IDE, my development environment, would need to recognize how to read JSX for that to work correctly. In the case of Vue, raw JavaScript. So that makes it very light, raw HTML plus JavaScript, light, convenient, very natural to work in. So that's one of the things I really appreciate. You can keep them separate if you wanted to. It's also very lightweight. It's considered the lightest of the three framework. All right. Now, in terms of capabilities, I would say it's pretty much on par with what React has to offer. It doesn't strive to have the batteries included library philosophy of Angular, but there's a number of plugins that we can use for that. So let's take a look at Vue. I'm going to crack open the Vue example. Again, there should not be any surprises for us over here. Click OK, boom, HTTP request is sent out, 200 OK, and here's the response that we get. Cool, all right, but what does the code look like? Well, again, if I can just give you a quick tour, let's go actually, and here, Vue source, and again, that's what's generated for me when I generated the Vue project, app.vue. Here's my code, and it's broken down actually into three sections. The first is my template, the Vue, right? Which is what we're seeing. Actually, sorry, that's not even my code. You'll notice over here that there's a call to a hello world component. It would actually be in here. Hello world, there we go. Here's my template. You should have recognized this, right? Div, hello, what's your name, my paragraph for my message. You'll notice there's bindings as well. Input v-model, view-model equals name, v on click greet, so we want to call some code. Here we're using double mustache notation similar to Angular that we've seen earlier to display the message itself. So a lot of similarities, but this is standard HTML at this point, right? Browsers would not know what to do with a v on with a v model over here, but Vue will take care of that. But again, standard HTML. Here I've got a script block, which again is standard HTML. That's standard JavaScript over here. And I'll come back to what this code does in a moment. And down below, I just kept that in here that was provided for me. But here I've got scope style. So any style that I want to apply to that component is right here. And again, using standard CSS, standard HTML. And I think that's cool over here. But let's go back to the code. Here's the code for my Vue application. There's not that much to it. The name is, well, required in my case. And actually, there's two ways by which I can create a Vue application, either by using a JavaScript object or using a class. I went with a JavaScript object in here, similar to my JavaScript, my React application over here. There's two ways by which I could create this application, using a function or an actual class. Same idea. In this case, I kept it simple, raw JavaScript object. Name, hello world, that simply says, whenever we have a hello world tag, we want to inject that component in here. That's it. Data. When we first initialize that component, what field do we want to have? Well, I want to have a name field, which is an empty string, message, empty string. I define my state over here. State will be managed by me. So I'm not going to rely on atomic change like I did with React. It's going to be almost a mix between React and Angular when it comes to its programming model. Here I'm going to define methods. There's only one, which is greet. That's the method that gets called over here when the button is clicked, the onClick greet. So this is the code. And if you take a look at the code over here, once again, it's the same JavaScript code that I've showed you earlier in my raw JavaScript example. Vue doesn't have a preferred AJAX handler. Use whatever technology you want. Axios commonly used out there, but there's so I'm using raw JavaScript for that. I could have maybe simplified it by using Axios, but I want to minimize the number of dependencies and component I throw out here. So this is, for all intended purposes, identical to what I've shown you previously. Await the response, and notice what I'm doing over here. This dot message, so the message field that I set over here, this dot message equals the response that I've received from the server. So this dot message, which will also bind itself to that template over here, show me the message in here. So there's a bit of two-way binding, similar to Angular, happening over here. Whenever I change a variable, the data, through my code over here, that updates the view. If the view gets updated, for example, the user types in a name, then the variable is updated as well. So two-way binding, similar to Angular. But the way that UI updates work is more closely in line to the way React does it. One of the things that I did not mention about React, and I don't want to get too technical at this point, but one of the things that people really like, developers really like about React, is its speed. And I can attest to that, having worked with React, Angular, Vue. That's another thing to recognize about React, is that it's not the fastest of the three. I don't want to say it's slow, but I have encountered situations in React, especially when I'm working with large, complex page, which can have tens of thousands of rows in a table, for example, binding all of that, that adds significant overhead that is noticeable by the end user. However, in React, doing the same would actually typically be faster, because of the way that React updates views as opposed to the way Angular does it. Angular, when the view gets changed for whatever reason, Angular rescans the entire DOM tree and updates the DOM tree to be identical to the changes that we've done. That's actually a heavy process. On the other hand, React and Vue use what we call a VDOM, virtual DOM, where the state of the view is actually stored in a set of JavaScript data structure, not DOM data structure, so raw JavaScript, light, very fast, and whatever changes that we do are cataloged in those data structure, and then, and only after that, we apply the changes to the physical DOM. So by doing the changes over here to an internal structure in JavaScript instead of the physical DOM, it ensures that we can minimize the number of DOM operation, document object model operation, we need to do to update our view. So that's another advantage of React and Vue. It is typically very performant when it comes to updating the UI. So we've looked at three different libraries, three different frameworks, I should say, when it comes to developing web application. And we also talked about jQuery before that. And I wanted to slice the issue right now. Should I use jQuery, or should I consider a framework? Honestly, today, go with a framework. Which one should you go with? I don't want to favor one above the other. I do have my favorite. I've mentioned it previously, but that's just a general a preference. It doesn't mean that I'm always going to use Vue for every application I'm going to create. There are places where Angular would be preferable. There are places where React would be preferable. So alternatives, just to name a couple over here, in terms of library, you've got Backbone, Polymer, Sencha. In terms of framework, you could talk about Meteor, Ember, Svelte, Next. Next and Svelte actually are growing a lot in popularity, so I would personally keep an eye on them. They haven't exploded to the level of the three big ones that we've talked about just yet, but I'm certainly keeping a close eye on them. Meteor is actually a full stack framework, meaning that it deals with both the client and the server, something that everything we've looked at this point does not deal with. All right? It deals only with the client. As an addendum, I've also included non-JavaScript framework, where actually here's one I'd like to recommend you take a look at, Elm. It's its own programming language as well as structure for developing web application. Now, of course, web browsers only speak JavaScript. They don't speak Elm. So Elm needs to be compiled to JavaScript code, but it's actually a very nice language, very elegant and predictable structure when it comes to developing web application. It's very much in line with the way React does it, but instead of having to handle reactive programming and state management at the language level, this is done for us at the library level, the framework level. Blazor is it's fundamentally .NET on the web. It's a bit heavy in my opinion. All right, it works, but I'm not sure I would recommend it for production use. It's kind of neat. Oh, cool. I can use a C# to create web application, but it's a bit on the heavy side. I also included Vue in here. Now, I'll be honest with you, that's also a personal preference over here. It's based on the Rust programming language. If you're not familiar with Rust, it's a system programming language that was designed to allow you to write fast yet safe code that should not crash and burn or corrupt itself, that sort of thing. It was voted 4 years in a row as the favorite language in the what was the name? Stack Overflow developer survey. So for 4 years in a row now, including last year, it was voted as the favorite programming language out there. And Vue is actually a very much reactive Elm-ish. It's inspired heavily from Elm way to develop a web application, but instead of using JavaScript, we would be using the Rust programming language. Instead of compiling to JavaScript, it actually compiles to something called WebAssembly. WASM, WebAssembly, which would be a binary format by which we can run our application. And one of the things I like about WebAssembly is that it allows me to push fundamentally binary code to my web browser that can then be transformed to highly optimized machine code that can run much faster than JavaScript code, and use a great framework to do that. I've had a lot of success and a lot of fun working with you myself. So just a little, just sharing that with you. And this is not meant to be a comprehensive list. There are numerous additional frameworks we could consider for that. I've got a question over here. How does one determine which framework to use? Oh, that's a great question. Whoops. There you go. Which to choose? Let's go there. Let's talk about that. And some things to consider. I'm not necessarily going to give you a table highlighting the pros and cons. There's plenty out there on the internet. But there's some things I would certainly take into consideration when it comes to choosing which framework should I use. Starting with the team experience. You know your team better than me. So based on our experience, our strengths and weaknesses, what model might work best for us? Again, if we're looking for something a little bit more traditional, we want to ramp up our skills fairly quickly, I would be tempted to go the Angular route, right? On the other hand, if you've got a bit more of a keen team, willing to explore new programming model, recognizing that, hey, we'll have to maybe relearn the way we think about our code, I'd like to recommend, let's take a look at React, right? React, in terms of performance, in terms of development speed, will probably give you more advantage. And personally, I'm even going to add that it'll probably lead to cleaner code than if you were doing the equivalent with Angular. But you do need to make sure that your team changes their way of thinking about the code, right? So that's a cultural change, a significant cultural change over here. I'm not saying it's tremendously difficult, but the reason why I'm emphasizing that is if we start writing React code with, say, a Angular mentality, we're going to make a mess, right? We want to start the code with the right mentality. Where does Vue fit in here? Well, I like to think that if you're looking for a fast, convenient, yet widely used framework out there, that again is kind of, I don't want to say necessarily a middle ground between React and Angular. That would be a disservice to Vue, but it's its own framework over here, model Vue, Vue model. You could consider using Vue. If you come from a Silverlight slash, I don't know, what is it, WPF, Windows Presentation Framework, the structure will probably be familiar to you as well. So the way of thinking might be more in line with that as well. So what's your team experience? And you could also consider, if your team is willing to try on a new programming language, maybe taking a look at Elm as well. Another important one is also long-term support. There's a lot of libraries and frameworks out there. I love technologies. I love geeking out on web development. If this presentation hasn't betrayed that, I don't know what would. But realistically speaking, for production code, I want to make sure that a code that I write today is maintainable for a good long time. I want to start with the mentality that the code I write today, no matter how hip and modern the library or the framework that I'm using is today, give it 5 years, give it 10 years, it will become legacy. So that's why I'm generally hesitant to start for production, start using newer library. Like I said, I'm keeping an eye on Next and Svelte over here. There's a lot of really great stuff, but is it going to reach a point where I can trust it to be maintained long-term? Angular, long-term support. React, long-term support. They're there to stay. They're not going to disappear overnight. Same thing with Vue. It's well established by now in the industry. There's some otherwise, like Meteor, which had a meteoric rise, all pun intended, but its popularity is waning. In contrast with, again, the Angulars, the Reacts, those type of libraries. So long-term support. Now, by long-term support, by the same token, is I want to pick the technologies that are not just going to be relevant 10 years from now, but also relevant today and vice versa. So that's one of the reasons why I'm going to hesitate to recommend jQuery as a starting point. If you're developing or modernizing an existing application, you want to have a drop-in replacement for your code to kind of enhance your page a little bit, yeah, jQuery might be a solution, but it's a stopgap measure. And jQuery's popularity is waning at the detriment or benefit really of Angular, Vue, React, and those type of libraries. Now, there's not one of those three that are on a trajectory right now to replace the other two, right? They're very different. There's not one that is better than the other. So I don't think, I could be wrong, but based on the state of the market right now, I do not see another JavaScript library or framework attaining the level of penetration, popularity that we've had over here with jQuery, right? For better or for worse. I love jQuery. It has served me very well throughout my career, but today, again, I would hesitate to start any serious project using jQuery. I continue to use jQuery here and there if I'm helping somebody add functionality to an existing application, It's a nice way to do that. But if I'm going to develop a new application or rewrite an existing application, I'm going to start with one of our existing, one of our frameworks that we've discussed, or maybe an alternative altogether. So we've talked about modernization as well. What are we hoping to achieve? And be aware that, and this is important over here, the three frameworks that we've talked about so far will require us to modernize our development approaches, right? Moving towards more agile DevOps type of approaches. We are going to need to change our tooling as well. A text editor is no longer enough. React, Vue, Angular, and all the other frameworks out there will require the developer to have Node installed, to be able to run some Node commands on their machine. Without Node, you will not be able to develop with those frameworks. So the tooling will have to be modernized to use that. Those frameworks will also typically encourage you to use things like Git for your source code repository. So modernize our approach. If you're in a situation where you cannot modernize your development environment, for example, your organization forces you to use older version of Visual Studio, it may not be desirable to use some of those newer frameworks. You'll want to consider, I would strongly recommend, consider using Visual Studio Code, right? Not Visual Studio. Visual Studio is fine, it's great, but Visual Studio Code is the environment that most developers will use to develop those applications. In my case, in my demonstration, I've actually used WebStorm. Now, WebStorm is a commercial project as opposed to Visual Studio Code, which is an open source project. So it's free, no licenses required, developed and sponsored by Microsoft. WebStorm is a commercial product. I think it's the finest editor out there when it comes to developing web applications out there. But again, it's commercial. So you would have to get commercial licenses for your team should you choose to use it. But really, if you want to get serious about web development, either go with Visual Studio Code or WebStorm. There's alternative, and you're welcome to review them out there, but these are the two big ones out there. So modernization will be necessary. And training, well, I'm going to look at this from two perspectives. Yes, this is a promotional seminar. Yes, I work for a web-based solution, and yes, we certainly hope that we're going to see you in some of our fine training when it comes to those wonderful technologies. But realistically speaking, all right, I hope you realize at this point, I am being genuine. I'm not being a salesperson over here. To maximize your use of those technologies, I strongly recommend, formally or informally, your team gets trained on those technologies, right? Let's not just take a look at a couple of readmes over here and then just generate some code and start hacking away trying to figure out how things work, because you will most likely start off on the wrong foot, start off down the wrong path when it comes to developing those applications. And I'm saying this over here genuinely as somebody who has worked with, coached, trained, and of course developed plenty of code when it comes to web application. One of the reason I do what I do today is I generally believe in the value behind training, right? It can greatly accelerate your development effort. More importantly, start you off on the right path. And this is something I can attest to that I've encountered so many times where we're going to start, for example, a training session, and the participants will say, yeah, I've been using Angular, I've been using React for a couple of months now, but I can't figure out anything. Nothing is working, or I'm not sure how to do these things. By the time they finish their session, it's like, okay, now I get it. Now I see how to structure my application and handle so many issues and blockers that that we're faced with throughout the last couple of months. So unfortunately, the last couple of months, might as well say that it was not necessarily wasted, but far from being as efficient as it could have been, right? So I do want to emphasize the importance of training. I'm not saying you have to go through us. We would be flattered, of course, if you choose us. You could, of course, do it internally. If you have existing gurus who are good at communication, presentation skills, we can certainly use that. But yes, let's make sure that we start off on the right foot. There's plenty of great training resources out there. Take advantage of it. And speaking of which, I'm going to wrap it up with that slide fundamentally. We were talking about our WebAge courses. When it comes to that, there's our Mastering jQuery. And actually, we have other jQuery courses available. Angular and React, there's not just one course. There's a number of courses we can take when it comes to that. And same thing when it comes to Vue. I just dropped in the introduction to Vue.js. We also have courses that deals with Bootstrap and other emerging as well as established training courses. You're more than welcome to check out our catalog of courses, webagesolutions.com. For the vast majority of our courses, we actually own and develop our own courseware. If you've taken any training with us, one of the things that we do pride ourselves on is our labs as well, giving you hands-on time to really practice the technology. I've worked with a lot of training providers in my career. I've been in the business for well over 20 years myself. And WebAge is the only organization that I know that when a lab is developed, they'll actually test it internally before release it to our clients. I've seen that happen too often where labs are developed internally by different training organizations, and then we get the client to test them on behalf of the organization. So we generally have good quality training material for you. So I'm going to wrap up my sales speech with that. All right. And by the same token, I'm actually going to wrap up the formal presentation. Let's tackle the question. A number of good questions came up over here. I'll go down to this one over here. Is jQuery used by the popular web frameworks, Angular, React, Vue? No. jQuery is not used by any of those. They use their own approach. Technically, they could have used jQuery, but it was more efficient to re-implement what jQuery does, but for their specific workflow. So going back to your question, no, it is not used by those frameworks. And if I can extend that a little bit, should I use jQuery with, say, React or jQuery with Vue? Short answer, don't. All right, technically you could. Realistically, I definitely advise against that. Hoping that answers your question. If not, don't be shy to ask again. Another question, is it typical for a front end to adopt one framework, or is use of a couple of frameworks common? That's another great question. Short answer, for one application, I would strongly recommend stick with one framework, right? Even if it's an MPA, multiple page application, stick with one framework for a couple of reasons. First of all, avoid diluting the skills of your team. I mean, learning React, learning Angular, learning Vue is an investment. And the more you force your team to work with different technology, the more you dilute your investment, the less specialization you have when it comes to that. Also, the development models are different. The life cycles are different between them when it comes to compiling, publishing, that sort of thing. It should not lead to incompatibility in an MPA type of environment, but it would typically imply slightly different publishing model, getting the code from dev to prod out there. And finally, one thing you will not be able to do is in the same application, trying to say both Vue and React. That ain't gonna work, right? They'll both be fighting one another for control. They're not designed to work together. So going back to your question, it's a great question. If you can, try to stick to one per application. Try to stick to one framework, and certainly don't try to use two or more frameworks together. It ain't gonna work, I'm sorry to say. Again, I'm hoping that this answers your question. If there's any other questions, please don't be shy. I'm available for that. I really appreciated your participation today. And thank you very much for joining us on a Friday. For some of you, during your lunch hour, for other of you early on in the morning. So I really appreciated it. And again, apologies for the scheduling mishap that we had on Wednesday. So I do appreciate you guys taking the time to join us today. So that said, I'm going to deem the seminar formally completed. Again, if you guys have any questions for me, I'm certainly available to answer them, technical or otherwise. But that said, I hope everybody has a fantastic weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, and certainly I hope we're going to see you guys again in a training session or another free seminar in the not too distant future. And thank you very much for all the feedback from you guys. I appreciate it. Oh, one last thing. I recognize that, hey, there's only so much we can discuss over here, but I'll go back to the title slide over here. There's my email address, jbilodeau@webhsolutions.com. If you guys have any other questions for me, drop an email. I'll do my best to answer it. All right. So at this point, again, there's about 15 minutes left before the session. If you have any further questions, stick around. Otherwise, we'll wrap things up in not too long. And if we do wrap up the presentation before I've answered your question, oh, will you be sharing the code? Yes, I will certainly share that with you guys. It is actually available online right now through my GitHub account. I'll put that in the answer window over here. Boom, sent to all. And I'll make sure that this is also included in the email, the follow-up email that will be sent for you guys. So here's the code, the same code that I walked you guys through. You take advantage of it. And if you make $1 million off of it, we just ask for 5% commission. Nah, just kidding, it's all open source. Enjoy. Pleasure. All right, once again, here's my email address. In case, again, in case a question comes up later on, don't be shy to drop me an email. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap things up at this point. Again, thank you very much for joining me. I see participants are starting to leave. It was a pleasure presenting you those technologies that I'm very excited by. And again, hopefully we'll see you again soon in another presentation. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend.